My girlfriend said, "I will always miss him. You have to accept it." Then she left our anniversary dinner to visit her ex-boyfriend in the hospital. When she came back, her bags were already by the door. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. My name is Bruno. I'm 29 years old, and until recently, I was in a 3-year relationship with Olivia, 27. I met Olivia in a fairly quiet stage of my life. I already had a steady office job with pretty structured hours. It wasn't a job I was passionate about, but it gave me stability. I could pay my expenses, save a little, and maintain an orderly routine. She, on the other hand, had a more flexible lifestyle. She sold floor arrangements on Facebook. Sometimes she did well, sometimes not so much. Her income was variable, to put it mildly. From the beginning, there was an obvious economic difference, but I never saw it as a problem. I had the advantage of living in a house that my father had lent me. I didn't pay rent, which allowed me to cover most expenses without feeling an excessive burden. When Olivia moved in with me, the dynamic became quite clear. I took care of practically everything, and she contributed occasionally, mainly by paying for the internet or buying small things for the house. It wasn't something that bothered me at the time. I interpreted it as a phase. I thought she would eventually stabilize her business or find something more permanent. Besides, there was something about Olivia that made me feel it was worth the effort. She was affectionate, she knew how to be attentive when she wanted to, and in the good moments, she really seemed committed to the relationship. However, there was one element that was always present, although very faintly: her ex-boyfriend, Santiago. When we started dating, Olivia mentioned her past relationship as something she had already gotten over. She told me they had been together for 2 years, and that it had been a complicated relationship. She didn't go into too much detail at first, but over time I started to understand the picture better. Santiago was, according to her own words, a disaster. Unfaithful, manipulative, with constant mood swings. Olivia told me that during that relationship, she had forgiven multiple infidelities, not one or two, but several. She also hinted that he had a way of making her feel guilty for everything, even when it was obvious that he was at fault. I listened to all that with a certain disbelief, but also with the feeling that she had learned from that experience. It was easy to assume that after something like that, a person wouldn't look back. And for a long time, that seemed true. In the 3 years we were together, Santiago practically didn't appear in our conversations. Only at the beginning, in those talks where you share your past so the other person understands where you're coming from. After that, total silence. There were no messages, no mentions, nothing to indicate that he was still relevant in her life, or at least that's what I thought. Our relationship progressed fairly linearly. We got used to living together, to sharing spaces, to dividing the household chores more or less equally. There were arguments like in any relationship, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. On weekends, we used to go out to eat or just stay home watching something. Olivia had a changeable character sometimes, but it wasn't something I considered alarming. I thought it was part of her personality. If I'm completely honest, there were signs that I probably ignored. For example, her tendency to avoid deep conversations about the future. Every time I mentioned long-term plans like saving to buy something together or making some major change, she would change the subject or answer ambiguously. At the time, I interpreted it as a lack of clarity, not a lack of commitment. There was also the fact that she never talked about completely closing off her past. She didn't mention him, but she didn't deny him either. It was as if she had simply put him in a drawer without really resolving it. But one tends to arrange the pieces to fit the narrative one wants to believe. And I wanted to believe that everything was fine. Our 3rd anniversary arrived without too much planning. Neither of us was particularly a fan of over-the-top celebrations, but we decided to do something simple, a dinner at a quiet restaurant. I remember that day too clearly. Olivia was in a good mood. She dressed up more than usual, which I thought was a nice touch. I made a reservation at a place we knew she liked. Nothing fancy, but nice. It was one of those places where you can converse without having to raise your voice with dim lighting and soft music in the background. During dinner, everything seemed normal. We talked about everyday things. Her work, mine, some recent anecdotes. We laughed several times. There were even moments when I thought we were at one of our best points. That feeling of stability, of shared routine, of being comfortable with each other. The food arrived, and we continued conversing. There was no tension, no awkward silences. If someone had been observing from the outside, they would have thought we were a completely functional couple. And then her phone rang. It wasn't anything dramatic in itself, just a call. But the way Olivia reacted completely changed the atmosphere. She looked at the screen, and in a matter of seconds her expression changed. She turned pale, not in an exaggerated way, but enough for me to notice immediately. She answered without saying much, just a hello, and listened in silence. I could see how her posture changed. Her back tensed. Her gaze got lost somewhere, as if she were processing something she didn't expect. She said almost nothing during the call. She just nodded and answered with monosyllables. After a few seconds that felt longer than normal, she got up from the table. "I have to step out for a moment," she said without looking directly at me. She didn't wait for my answer. She left the restaurant almost immediately. The way she did it wasn't normal. It wasn't just any call. There was urgency in her movement, in her tone, in everything. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. At first, I thought it could be something related to her family, maybe a problem, an emergency, but something didn't fit. She hadn't given me any explanation, not even a minimal one. I waited a few minutes, but the discomfort began to grow. Finally, I got up and went toward the exit. I found her near the door with her phone still in her hand, clearly upset. Her eyes were wet, as if she were holding back tears. It was at that moment that I knew something wasn't right. "What happened?" I asked her. She hesitated a few seconds before answering, and that hesitation was what set off all the alarms in my head. "It's Santiago," she finally said. The name dropped like something completely out of place. Not because I didn't know who he was, but because I hadn't heard him come out of her mouth for years. "What's wrong with him?" I asked, trying to keep calm. Olivia took a deep breath, as if she were preparing to say something she knew I wasn't going to like. "He had an accident," she replied. "He's in the hospital." There was an uncomfortable silence between us. I could notice how her anxiety was increasing. Her hands trembled slightly, and she avoided looking directly at me. "He's stable," she added quickly, "but I want to go see him." That last sentence completely changed the situation. It wasn't just information, it was a decision. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "You want to go see him?" I repeated, making sure I had heard correctly. She nodded and then started to cry. It wasn't a contained cry. It was obvious that the news had affected her in a much deeper way than I would have expected. At that moment, everything I thought I knew about our relationship began to wobble. Because it's one thing to find out that your partner's ex had an accident, and quite another to see her react as if he were still someone central in her life. "Bruno," she said through tears, "I need to go." That's when I understood that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation, and that I was probably about to hear something I wasn't going to be able to ignore. I saw her waiting for some reaction from me, as if there was still a possibility that I would accept that without questioning it, as if what she was asking was reasonable. "I will always miss him. You have to accept it," she said. Finally, there was no pause. There was no attempt to soften it. There was no additional explanation. Just that sentence. And then she left, literally turned around and ran out without looking back, leaving the conversation incomplete, leaving dinner halfway, leaving me standing at the entrance of the restaurant, not understanding at what point everything had deviated so much. I stood still for a few seconds, not out of indecision, but because my mind was trying to process what I had just heard. It wasn't a normal argument. It wasn't just any disagreement. It was a direct declaration of something that theoretically should have been left behind years ago. I returned to the table slowly. The food was still there, untouched. The drinks half finished. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't anymore. I sat down and observed the place for a few seconds. The other tables continued with their conversations, their laughter, their routines. No one seemed to have noticed anything. I took out my wallet, called the waiter, and asked for the check. There was no point in staying there any longer. While I waited, I checked my phone. No message, no call. Nothing to indicate that Olivia was reconsidering what she had just done. The check arrived. I paid without checking the amount too much. I left the money on the table and got up. The walk to the parking lot was automatic. I got into the car, and sat for a few seconds with my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. I wasn't thinking about anything specific, but there was a constant feeling of discomfort, as if something inside me was trying to accommodate a reality that didn't fit. Finally, I started the car and began to drive towards the house. The route that was normally routine felt longer that night. Not because there was traffic or any inconvenience, but because every minute seemed to give room for more questions. How was it possible that after 3 years that guy still had that level of importance? Why didn't I ever see it coming? And at what point exactly had I taken a back seat? When I got to the house, everything was silent. I went in, left the keys in their usual place, and sat on the sofa. The place felt strange, not because it had changed physically, but because the perception was no longer the same. I looked around and noticed details I hadn't questioned before. Her things in the living room, some personal items on the table, small signs that we share that space. All of that suddenly started to feel out of place. A few minutes passed before the phone rang. It was her. I looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Not because I was hesitating whether to do it or not, but because I needed to prepare myself for whatever she was going to say. I slid my finger and brought the phone to my ear. "Love," she began. I just wanted to apologize. Her tone was calmer than in the restaurant, but there was still some tension in her voice. I didn't answer. "I know it wasn't the best thing I could do," she continued. "But believe me, I'll make it up to you." There was a short pause. A woman simply cannot command her heart. That sentence remained floating in the silence. There wasn't much to add after something like that. It was a justification disguised as inevitability, as if her decisions weren't really decisions, but consequences of something she couldn't control. I kept saying nothing, not because I didn't have things to say, but because any answer at that moment seemed useless. She continued, "And I was also calling to tell you that I'm staying tonight with Santiago." Another pause. "He's fine, but I just want to make sure he doesn't lack anything." Fortunately, it was a minor blow. He only had a broken arm, but I want to take care of him. I hope you understand. The silence on the other end of the line grew heavier. "I love you. Goodbye." The call ended, and during all that time, I didn't say a single word. I stood with the phone in my hand for a few more seconds, listening to the tone that indicates the call has ended, as if that confirmed that what had just happened was real. Then I left the phone on the table. There was no emotional explosion. There was no immediate anger. It was something colder, clearer. I got up from the sofa and went straight to the bedroom. I opened the closet and stared at her things. Clothes, shoes, some boxes with personal items. Everything perfectly arranged, as if it were part of a life that no longer made sense in that place. I took a suitcase. I didn't do it in a hurry, but not with hesitation either. I simply started packing her things. First the most visible clothes, then the rest. I wasn't organizing, I wasn't folding carefully, I was just moving everything from one place to another in a practical way. Every object I put in the suitcase seemed to confirm the same thing. This was no longer a functional relationship. Not after what had just happened. Not after what she had said. Not after the decision she had made, without even considering the real impact. The process took more time than I expected, not because it was complicated, but because there were more things than it seemed. 3 years sharing space leaves its mark, even in the smallest details. When I finished, I closed the suitcase and left it near the front door, not as an impulsive gesture, but as a clear decision. I turned off the lights in the bedroom and returned to the living room. I didn't sleep in the bed that night. It didn't make sense. I settled on the sofa with a light blanket and closed my eyes. The exhaustion was there, but it wasn't enough to completely disconnect. There were moments when my mind went back to the scene in the restaurant, to her words, to the call, to the way everything had changed in a matter of minutes. Eventually I fell asleep, but it wasn't a real rest. I woke up at 7 in the morning, not by alarm, but out of habit. I got up slowly, like any other day, but with a different feeling in the air. More silence, more clarity. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. The process was automatic. Turn on the coffee maker, wait, pour. Then I prepared something simple for breakfast. I wasn't very hungry, but I needed to do something to keep moving. I sat at the table, took a sip of coffee, and looked towards the door. The suitcase was still there. There was no regret. There was no doubt, just a sort of uncomfortable calm, like when you make a difficult but logical decision. At 8 o'clock exactly, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't a loud knock. It was more controlled, as if whoever was on the other side didn't know exactly what to expect. I knew it was her. I didn't need to confirm it. I sat for a few more seconds without getting up immediately. The sound repeated. Then I left the cup on the table and stood up. I walked to the door with the same calm with which I had done everything since the night before. And there the wait ended. I opened the door. Olivia was there, still wearing the same clothes as the day before. Her appearance reflected exhaustion, not extreme, but enough to notice that she hadn't slept well. She had slightly messy hair and puffy eyes, as if she had cried at some point during the night. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then, her gaze dropped and she saw the suitcase. She didn't need to ask. Her expression changed immediately, as if everything clicked in her head at the same time. No, she muttered first, almost automatically. Then she shook her head. No, love, no. She took a step inside without me moving to stop her, but without welcoming her either. Yes, I replied. I didn't raise my voice. It wasn't an emotional response. It was direct. That seemed to affect her more than any shout. What is this? She asked, although she clearly already knew. Why did you do this? Because what you did last night is not a minor thing, I replied. And what you said isn't either. She let out a short laugh, full of disbelief. Seriously, for that, she said, you're going to react like this for that? The way she minimized it was what finally confirmed that we were in two completely different realities. You left on our anniversary to go see your ex, I said. You said you'll always miss him, and then you called me to tell me you were going to stay with him all night. I paused briefly. Yes, that's why her expression hardened. You are incredible, she replied. You really are. She crossed her arms as if now she was evaluating me. Do you know what you are? She continued. Immature. I didn't answer. You are an immature and insensitive person, she added, raising her voice a little. You can't understand something as basic as this. Something basic, I repeated. Yes, she said, you can't stand that your girlfriend has feelings, that she wants someone else. That's all. Fragile masculinity. That word hung in the air as if it were a definitive argument. I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. No, I said finally. What I can't stand is that my girlfriend still loves her ex after 3 years. She tensed up. You don't understand anything, she replied. No, Olivia, I continued. What doesn't make sense is that you defend that as if it were normal. We're talking about someone who is unfaithful to you multiple times. You told me yourself. That has nothing to do with it, she interrupted. It has everything to do with it, I replied. Because not only do you still remember him, but you react as if he were still your priority. She shook her head, frustrated. You don't know what you're saying, she said. Emotions don't work like that. Decisions do. I replied. That comment seemed to affect her more than the previous ones. Her posture changed. She was no longer confidently defensive, but with a mixture of anger and something closer to desperation. I have nowhere to go, she said suddenly. The change in tone was evident. That's not my problem, I replied. Of course it is, she replied. We've been together for 3 years. It would be fair if you left. I couldn't help but let out a short laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity of the logic. That I leave. I repeated. Yes, she said, it's the least you could do. I shook my head. This house belongs to my father, I replied. I live here because he lent it to me. I paused. It's not to support someone who clearly doesn't respect the relationship. My tone remained controlled, but the tension was already evident. She looked at me angrily. You are an idiot, she said, and you are acting as if none of this were serious, I replied. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes filled with tears again. You don't know what you're doing, she said. Yes, I do, I replied. I'm setting a boundary. That seemed to break something in her. You can't end a 3-year relationship that easily, she shouted. It wasn't easy, I replied. It was logical. That word made her react immediately. Logical, she repeated. That's what it is to you. 3 years are summed up in logic when things like yesterday happen. Yes, I replied. The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. Then her expression changed completely. It was no longer just anger, it was rage. I hate you, she said, almost spitting the words. I didn't answer. She turned towards a suitcase. You really did this, she said, more to herself than to me. She took it by the handle. For a second I thought she would simply take it, but no. She walked towards the window. Olivia, I managed to say without finishing the sentence, but it was too late. She threw open the window and threw the suitcase out. The impact was heard immediately. The suitcase opened upon hitting the ground, scattering its contents on the street. Clothes, personal items, everything was scattered. The silence inside the house contrasted with the chaos outside. She stood for a few seconds looking out the window, breathing heavily. Then she turned to me. See what you did? She said, pointing outside. I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. She shook her head and ran out. I opened the door a few seconds later. I saw her in the street, picking up her things through tears. Her movement was disorganized, desperate. Some people passed by and looked at the scene, but no one intervened. I hate you, she shouted without stopping picking up her things. I didn't approach. How could you do this? She continued. How could you end a 3-year relationship like this? I didn't answer, not because I didn't have an answer, but because it no longer mattered. She kept crying, picking up what she could, trying to shove everything back into the damaged suitcase. You are insensitive, she shouted. I never mattered to you. The words no longer had the same weight. They were part of the emotional discharge, not of a real conversation. Finally, she managed to gather most of her things. She closed the suitcase as best she could. She stood up. She looked at me one last time. I hate you, she repeated, this time with less force. Then she turned around and left. I stood at the door, watching her walk away. There was no attempt to stop her. There was no immediate regret, just a clear feeling that something had ended exactly at the point it had to end. I went back inside the house and closed the door. The silence returned, but this time it was no longer uncomfortable.